Excuse the Batman shirt. So, hi, I'm going to talk about a few things. First of all, a bit about AI and technology more broadly in the public service. I'm going to talk about a couple of things we need to think about and remember in terms of, I guess, warnings and concerns. I'm going to go through what I think is the real opportunity of technology more broadly, but AI in terms of taking advantage of the network out there as opposed to building sort of AI projects internally. So to start, I think in the public service, I'm still fairly new to the public service in Australia. I've only sort of been working it for a few years. And one of the things that's really struck me, particularly as a lifelong professional geek, is the aversion to technology more broadly. So you tend to find AI projects, you tend to find technology projects, you tend to find any use of technology in tiny little pockets around the public service. And you tend to find that innovative use of technology, like genuine innovation, where they're doing something clever and creative, tends to be, again, very much in pockets and not mainstreamed. In fact, the general population, not just in the public service, but in Australia more broadly, tends to outsource personal thinking about technology or responsibility with technology. So we have a real challenge right now about how we're going to engage in this world effectively, how we're going to have an innovative and creative and competitive society in Australia if we're basically just giving the technology to the geeks to play with, which, we're happy with. We'll continue to do it regardless. But if the rest of you don't get on board, then you're going to be missing out. So I want you to imagine for a second if everyone in the public service, because we're very much in the focus of the public service today, if everyone used technology effectively and creatively in their job, right? They could automate all kinds of processes. When I first got the job that I have at Department of Finance, working for John Sheridan, I went about immediately trying to automate as much of my job as possible so that I could go and request to take over data.gov.au, which was always the plan. And then I did, and it was great. But going into the job specifically thinking, how can I make this job more effectively, is a very different perspective than going into a job and saying, how do I learn how to do what I'm told to do and then follow that thing forevermore? A lot of people end up identifying the value of the process that they follow as a value that they themselves have, which I think is a bit of a limitation. So data-driven decision-making. You can't really do any of this clever AI stuff unless you have data, unless you have data-driven decision-making, unless you value the role of data in your organisation, which is increasingly happening, which is great to see. But again, it's happening generally in pockets here or there. I've seen a number of cases, and I won't say which department, but it wasn't either of the ones I work for right now, but I saw a case where a department put out a survey to find out how much money was being spent on a particular product as part of their research. I received the survey on behalf of the department I was working for at the time, and I wrote back to them and said, well, I could go and figure this out, but it'll be wrong. So here's the last 15 years worth of contract data where I've done 15 minutes worth of analysis, and I can tell you exactly how much the entire public service has spent on that product from any provider out there. And they said, oh, thank you very much, but can you still fill out the survey? And I said, no, and they got very angry. And that was fine, I still said no, it was a waste of my time. But it was a waste of their time. We have so much data we can use. In the government, outside the government, OECD data, RBA data, ABS data, private sector data. Like, there's so much stuff out there that we can use that we tend to say, what do we have in my little pocket of the world and how do I better use that? And then we go and build an AI and a process and a system and buy some expensive software to figure out how to better use what we think we own. But we miss these much greater opportunities. I'm going to get to Gov as an API in a minute. But just going on my further little imagination journey, imagine if we had just better intelligence generally in our technology. Imagine if technology wasn't just the IT department, but where everyone could pick up and use the tools that will help them be more effective in their job. Then you start to generate a whole bunch more data, generate the opportunity for a lot more intelligent systems, for a lot more, all kinds of clever things could be done. Who's the original AI that we've all, or most of us in this room, how many people here are gamers? At least a few. We've been dealing with AIs for a long time. We've been fighting them for many years. The fact is that a lot of people's expectation of systems is actually from gaming, strangely enough. There's the annual report on gaming culture in Australia, I think is coming out this week or next week. It's always worth looking at because a huge proportion of Australians actually do gaming every day. So if we're not designing our our services, Freudian, as games to actually respond to the changing expectations of people who are increasingly a gaming culture, then we're missing out on an opportunity. And some of the AI work in there is very, very clever. And finally, like looking at, obviously there's great opportunities to use AI for, doing complicated assessments, for doing risk assessment, for doing complicated predictions and trends analysis and forecasting and all kinds of clever stuff that you can't necessarily do within one individual brain very, very quickly. So, those rapid computations are very, very clever. However, a couple of the things that I thought might be worth warning about is where we start to outsource our responsibility and accountability. We'll come to that in a second, but one of the examples I'm working on at the moment in the DTO, and we've actually blogged about this, if you want more information go to dto.gov.au, we're actually building a service analytics capability. The idea is to pull in all service analytics, so anything which is service delivery, so your website analytics, your digital transaction service analytics and logs, pulling your help desk and your telephony and your social media and anything which has got to do with service delivery, being able to pull all those analytics across the entire APS into one place, de-identified of course, because we actually care very much about privacy because we are geeks and we're paranoid. But if you have that de-identified data and you can say, I don't care who the user is, but I can see that the user went had to go across 10 different websites before they found what they were looking for. Oh, everyone that goes to this also goes to this. Maybe we should associate them. Oh, look, no one seems to be going to these 10 websites that have spent millions of dollars on them. Maybe we should reprioritize our funding. Starting to actually get, for the first time ever, a whole of government evidence base on service delivery. We're pretty excited about this. In the first case, there's some really stupid intelligence stuff that we could do with it, around basic reporting, around prioritizing, around looking at user journeys and stuff. But you can imagine down the track some of the clever things that we could do with that. So we're certainly going to be looking to play with people and with academics and with researchers and with people who are interested in this kind of stuff. But I wouldn't necessarily throw it all into an AI system and expect magic to suddenly appear. The most intelligent systems we have are actually up here. And we need to always remember that the cleverest things we can do is when we can make it available for people to do stuff with it. Even if we can, make a lot of the stuff more automated, we need to be responsible for it. And there are a lot of emerging communities in the public services, the Data Analytics Centre of Excellence, which is effectively a user group for the agencies that are doing really clever big data projects today. Really great stuff happening in there, and if anyone is in the APS that's not involved in that, they should. But there's also the Open Data Community Forum, which is more about open data, not big data, not necessarily AI, but these are communities of people who care about this space who are obviously going to get more and more involved. So let me get back to some of the warnings. First of all, if we take an AI system and we outsource responsibility, we start to raise some problems. There's a fantastic paper that I would commend to you all by Maria, who's actually in the audience somewhere. It's called Computer Says No, Governing by the Rules. I'll circulate a link to this on Twitter after the talk. But there's a great quote here. If the decision maker in the APS uses the recommendations of a system in making a decision, then they cannot deny this. And if the system cannot explain its reasoning, then how do they decide if the information is credible, relevant, and significant to the decision to be made? You start to create a real accountability block when you're not sure how the decision was come to in the first instance. And that's a real challenge I think we're going to have to face as we adopt more and more of these systems. So you start to outsource your responsibility, and who's now legally responsible when it comes to the legislative implications of the decisions we make in government all the time. The second one is the accountability of a decision. So I'm sure a few of you will remember the Diebold systems that we used for elections in the US a few years back. Anyone want to throw their hands up that might remember that? It was hilarious. So they basically created these election systems that were completely fraudulent. You'd click on one candidate and magically the other candidate would get the vote. Very, very dodgy, very hilarious. Very bad for democracy, one would argue. But, it was a huge sort of thing about it at the time. But you got an election outcome which meant that one party won and got to rule the country. That's a fairly big decision for a system to make with no accountability. So I would argue that where we put in place systems that are making very big, very important decisions, like elections, or again, like some of the decisions maybe we make in government, I would argue that those systems should be open sourced. Because if we can't actually track exactly what is happening in the system, how can we trust it? How can we be assured of the outcome of that system? So I think there's a question there about the accountability of systems that we use in government, particularly if we start to outsource some of that decision-making into AIs. And finally, there's obviously the privacy questions and painting a picture. Given enough data, you can paint a picture of pretty much anything. So we do start to raise the question of, well, with more and more of our lives suddenly being accessible to these kinds of systems, how do we start to balance that out? Because the picture of a person, I'll try to not use too many P's, the picture of a person that you could make 30 years ago was quite different to a picture of a person you can make today, and that starts to have implications as well. So, warnings aside, let's jump into one thing which is both a warning and an opportunity. If we're as free as the tools we use, which is something I say quite often, I don't think a lot of people think about it in those terms, but I think it's quite true. The tools that you use define how you work, how you play, how you interact with people, how you do pretty much everything, right? So if you are as free as the tools you use, then systems can also be used to reinforce the status quo. So where we start to see AIs actually codifying the assumptions or the biases or the impressions or policy perspectives or the nudging that they want to have, or all kinds of interesting stuff, we can start to see some interesting behaviours happening as a result. And I think that's worth always keeping in mind as well. So from my perspective, the real AI opportunity is in the network. Gov as an API is the concept that, I'm hoping everyone knows what an API is, an application programmable interface. It's the idea of machine-to-machine interactions and applications and all kinds of stuff. If you can make all of the data and content, whether it's websites or documents or whatever, and systems, the actual service, transaction services that government provides, if you can make all of these API enabled, and by the way, that takes into account security and privacy and controls. You can have secure APIs just as much as you can have open APIs. So what should be secure, and what should be open. But if you can make it all API enabled, you start to break down that nexus of the monolith of government. I'm going to build an end-to-end massive system that only does this one thing particularly well, which means that A, to respond to user needs and to go down that citizen-centric route that the previous gentleman spoke about so well, is very hard. So we need to take a more modular approach to our systems design, to our systems implementation, to our systems more generally thinking, but more importantly to the culture of government. We need to get away from the idea that government provides all the things to all the people and get towards the idea that whatever government does, if it does it in a way that enables people to be able to solve some of their own problems, to create a market, an economy, an ecosystem of service and information delivery, now we can get information and data and systems to be more mashable and interfaceable by everybody. Then we can use all kinds of tools. It doesn't have to be the latest shiny AI of today. It doesn't have to be the latest crowdsourcing today tool of tomorrow. We actually start to open up for whatever is best of breed today, tomorrow, and into the future to be able to build upon those foundations of what government does. So governance and API, we've written about it a little bit on the DTO. I've done a lot of speeches about it. I won't go into too much detail, but I will say that part of my personal goal, and DataGov.au was a start to this journey, is to actually enable Gov as an API in Australia. We would be the first government in the world, the first country in the world to do it properly if we can do it, because everywhere else has said transformation is about iterating on the business process that we already have. I say transformation is actually about changing the model to something that is more future-proof, that is more mashable, that is more sustainable, and that actually leverages the best resource that we have in this country, which is the clever people that can actually do stuff for themselves. So it's about creating this ecosystem and moving from a hierarchy to a network, more peer review kind of approach. And I mean, part of this, of course, is about the fact that today we have unprecedented power of citizens. 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, a couple thousand years ago, individuals in a community, in a society, didn't really have a lot of power, right? They basically got pushed around by whoever had the biggest sword or the biggest gun or the biggest wealth or whatever. But today people have, in a massively distributed way, the power to publish whatever they want, the power to communicate with and collaborate with whomever they please, the power to monitor. Now, there's always been the state monitoring the people, but now the people can monitor the state, and indeed people can monitor each other. Gets a little creepy, but it's still interesting. The final one, which is also really creepy, is the power of enforcement. A couple of geeks with a couple of computers can, disrupt an economy today. Again, it's not about it being right or wrong, it's just about a fundamental shift that we're seeing that's quite interesting. And of course, with 3D printing, we're starting to see the massive distribution of property. So everything's changing, and we're moving to this networked environment, networked system, if you like, whether people like it or not. And I think the role of government is to get on board. So rather than always looking towards the Internet of Things, maybe we should remember it's about the Internet of People. And from my perspective, we need to keep our finger on the digital pulse if we're going to make the most of AI and technology more broadly. And always remember that to get a mature, ethical and responsible use of these things, we need to be in the picture ourselves and be personally involved and responsible for the outcomes of anything that we do. and not outsource those decisions to a point where the computers get to always say yes. Thank you very much.